Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. Not too long ago, I had the pleasure of doing a podcast over on Cross Circle Squared with my good friend Benny on the topic of today's video, Alan Wake. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider heading over to Cross Circle Squared to get a more in-depth discussion. With that out the way though, let's jump into what could be considered the birth of what has come to be known as the Remedyverse. Consisting of both Alan Wake games, Control, and potentially Quantum Break, though that one's a little bit up in the air due to IP ownership, the Remedyverse is one of the most ambitious projects within the gaming space. They aren't the only games company that's ever done something like this, but they are definitely one of the best implementations of it. Starting with the original Alan Wake back in 2010, the developers, Remedy Entertainment, were looking to continue the success from the original two Max Payne games. Selling over 3 million copies, the original Alan Wake went on to be much loved from those who played it. On a surface level though, a lot of people would see it as just another horror game with action elements from the mid-2000s to early 2010s, as games were slowly starting to mature overall as a medium. It's not to say games back then weren't mature, however, the average game was typically pretty light on focusing on story, let alone thematic ideas. This does come with its own issues that I will get into later on in this video, but for now, the best way to describe Alan Wake, in my opinion, is as a psychological thriller, which is thankfully a genre that doesn't get oversaturated. Taking place in the fictional town of Bright Falls, Alan Wake and his wife Alice arrive in order to enjoy a vacation that is meant to help them both relax and work on the issues they've been having with their marriage. Immediately upon arriving, however, you'll notice Bright Falls feels more than just a town or a setting. It feels more like a character itself, and I hate to say it since everyone else does, but it is unavoidable, and that is the fact that this is very Twin Peaks inspired, and you will notice immediately just with the diner scene alone. While at said diner, Alan is meant to be meeting someone by the name of Stucky in order to get keys for the cabin, only to receive them from someone else who seems to be pretty ominous. Now, with the exception of Barry and the sheriff, you'll meet pretty much every key character that Alan's going to interact with throughout the story, which is a neat touch. After getting those keys and heading to the cabin on the eerily named Cauldron Lake, we learn of Alice's fear of the dark. In the business, we call this foreshadowing. Well, it's more like getting smacked in the face with a shovel and someone saying, "I bet you won't guess what the major theme is." I'm not actually complaining though, because it's actually interesting to note how far Remedy has come in their abilities of writing a compelling narrative, as you can see what the series will become in its infancy here. Once the lights are on and the not so happy couple are inside, Alice decides to surprise Alan with a typewriter in order to help him with his writer's block. However, since Alan is a giant fucking asshole, he gets mad, yelling at Alice, who only did this for Alan's sake. So filled with rage, Alan begins to shake, causing Alan to vacate. I'll stop it now. Walking off his own stupidity, Alan gets about halfway across the bridge only to hear Alice scream. Taking about 3 to 5 business days to react, Alan jaunts his way back to the cabin only to find a giant hole in the railing. Hearing a splash, he assumes Alice has fallen in. Again, taking his sweet ass time, Alan dives in after her only for everything to go dark, with him eventually surfacing, short of breath, confused, and dazed. In the only sensible action he takes in the early stages of the game, he heads off to find help and try and get some answers. This is where we start to get the first real taste of Alan Wake's gameplay in action. Being a third-person shooter, Alan Wake has some really interesting mechanics going on, while dropping the ball in some others, but more on that in a bit. You would assume, with the team being behind Max Payne, we would get some pretty damn tight action, and although they do some things incredibly well, Remedy deliberately made it so Alan didn't feel like Rambo, which is a smart way to use game mechanics to enforce a narrative decision, as I mentioned in my Dead Space video, wink wink. Only for it to fall a bit to the wayside though, as by the time you are done through a regular playthrough, you've probably killed a triple-digit amount of enemies. Beyond that minor complaint though, the limited weapon and ammo capacity works really well in driving the anxiety the game wants you to experience. Furthermore, the Tekken can't be damaged just by shooting them. You'll need to use a source of light, which in most cases will be your flashlight, in order to strip them of the darkness that surrounds them before shooting them. Plus, we also have access to the single greatest gameplay mechanic to ever exist in any game, and that is the ability to reload faster by tapping the reload button more. It's simple but brilliant, and I wish more games would do it. Alan gets access to a bunch of different tools in order to combat the darkness, from his trusty revolver, shotgun, hunting rifle, flare gun, flashlights, flares, and flashbangs. The player won't find themselves with a lack of options when it comes to dealing with the Taken. On top of these options, you can find light poles scattered throughout that will provide a lot of light that you can take refuge in. These despawn enemies and heal Alan, which is pretty useful. However, if you have listened to that podcast that I mentioned at the start of the video, you will hear me say that I don't really like this mechanic, at least 100%, because, as for me, I would have preferred it if it didn't get rid of the enemies, as once you see the light, you have no need to fight, since you will just beeline it there instead of having to deal with the actual game. And yes, this is 100% personal, but since Alan Wake as a game is relatively easy to beat, a little bit more challenge would have been more appreciated. Furthermore, at least on normal difficulty, you won't ever really run out of ammo or batteries, making the limited supply of these resources feel kind of pointless. The game's already pretty damn generous when it comes to what it gives you, but if you compound that with the fact that you can get caches that are left by Cynthia Weaver throughout levels, you then basically have an unlimited supply. It's honestly way too easy for its own good. By the late game, I was running around with max ammo, flashbangs, and flares to the point that I didn't even bother fighting half the time. I would just run from A to B. It just makes the game fall a little bit flat. If they had made the game just a little bit more difficult, have that little bit more challenge, I think it would have helped a lot. A strange addition to the game, and what I would hazard was some bigwig's idea, is the addition of collectibles and in-game achievements. I know they're both pretty commonplace, especially within the gaming space, by 2010, but to have them in a narrative-driven game just feels a little bit off. They feel like they were added in order to give replayability more so than any actual substance. At least the manuscript pages make sense, but the coffee mugs and everything else, I'm not too sure about. Since, realistically, due to the fact the game only has one ending, you will sit there and beat it once and not time and time again. It's not an overly long game, as you can beat it under 10 hours comfortably, but it is to me at least a game you might only play once or twice a year max, just to experience its story. The game itself would have been better off without the collectibles, and I would say probably the achievements as well. Even if they can be fun, they are pretty meaningless. I'm here to experience the story and world of Alan Wake more so than its gameplay, which, if you know me, is a little bit strange considering I'm typically a gameplay first type of guy. On paper though, the gameplay itself is really good, and I don't want to take away from that. Especially the combat, it is a lot of fun. It does have a few issues that pop up through the course of a full playthrough though, mainly the enemy variety itself, with it basically being a mix of a dude, a fast dude, a big dude, birds, and possessed objects. Sure, it works, but it could have done something more with the dark presence itself. I also haven't mentioned the tutorial yet. When you start, you get treated to a stalker-like section, akin to something like Mr. X from Resi 2, with the lumberjack, and this is a brilliant intro to a game. It's actually the thing I remember most about Alan Wake after all these years. So I think having a stalker enemy in the game to push Alan forward in his journey, especially with the light system, would have been a lot more interesting than just the hordes of Tekken. Not to say you couldn't have those fights, but I don't think we needed as many as we got. The only other real complaint I have is how often the Tekken throw shit at you. They are relentless. They don't stop. They just keep throwing over and over again, and it can be really frustrating when they're a mile away, so you can't really get a clean shot at them. So you either have to keep getting hit by the axes they throw, or wait until they eventually stop doing that stupid shuffle forward because they're close enough. And this isn't even the biggest sin of the game. The biggest sin the game commits is in Chapter 3. And for those who know, you know. But it's when Alan meets who he believes to be Elsa's kidnapper, and you have to do a fight alongside him. However, you don't get to just have a weapon like he does. You only get the flashlight. So you have to get rid of the darkness while he shoots. And he sucks. He can't hit anything more than 3 feet in front of him. And it is really frustrating, and I died to this a lot because he just would not make a single shot. Even the really tall enemies he couldn't hit. How big do you need their hitbox to be? Now thankfully they do fix this by the late game when you have the sheriff helping you, because she's actually useful. However, this does lead to one point that I will say that might make this game a little bit tough for people to enjoy, and that is the fact it has such a combat focus. As I said, it would have been better to have a stalker enemy where it can push the narrative forward more so than worrying about the combat. Because it's not that the combat's bad, but it's not a flawless system. What makes Alan Wake worth playing though is its characters. Not Alan himself though, he's an insufferable prick. But pretty much everyone else is great. From the unhinged FBI agent Nightingale that will shoot at civilians without hesitation like a fucking madman, to Barry, the real MVP of the story, to Thor and Odin, who are really eccentric and somehow aware of absolutely everything going on, to Cynthia, Sheriff Sarah, Thomas Zane, and the many others you'll come across. The characters of Alan Wake make it so memorable and stand out from a lot of games of its era. Just to plug the podcast again, I say it is the right game at the wrong time, and if it was made today instead of Alan Wake 2, or even reimagined by Remedy themselves, I think Alan Wake himself would be much better written and wouldn't come off as so abrasive. He wouldn't seem so dark to the others' bright characteristics. Another thing that makes Alan Wake worth playing though is its presentation, and that is the fact the game still holds up incredibly well. And yes, I know there is a remaster that you can play if you do want it to look just a little bit better. However, I think the original holds up incredibly well, except for the faces. They are the stuff of nightmares.
Brother,
Some of the textures are definitely dated, but the general level design being the way it is means the game's lighting really carries everything, and they've made something really special here, especially in the forests. When everything's in motion, the game looks brilliant. The other aspect of the presentation that is really well done, in my opinion, is the surprisingly good voice acting. Although Alan himself can be a little bit dry, and some characters are definitely a little bit campy, if you consider that the game is inspired by Twin Peaks, it all makes sense. As a cherry on top of the already incredible package we have, the game's OST is absolutely amazing, with a range from soft piano pieces to grungy pop, rock, and metal. The variety on display is something special, and it's something they would do justice to in the game's sequel. I mentioned earlier that the township of Bright Falls itself feels like a character, and it's shown throughout the game. Not so much just the town center, but the forest surrounding it as well. The town is a beacon of light, quite literally, whereas the forests don't have any lights running through them. They are unchecked darkness. It's the unknown. If you pay attention to most of the encounters and locations that Alan has to travel to, they are abandoned, run down, empty, devoid of life and light itself. This is one of the more subtle ways Alan Wake pushes this theme of light versus dark. Although a pretty cliche thematic device, it's done really well here. Just look at the name of the town, Bright Falls. It's right there. Bright, or light, falls or fades. This is where Alan Wake is at its strongest. Not the combat. Not that I hate the combat, I actually really enjoy it, but I think this game is so much better when it is trying to tell a narrative. The story isn't as deep as it wants to be, but the darkness versus light plot of the game at its very core is done incredibly well, and it is very enjoyable, and it only gets improved upon in Alan Wake 2. It's the give and take of it all. You can't just cast a shadow without light. Without light in the world, the darkness has nothing to feed upon, meaning it has to make sacrifices and concessions to get what it truly wants. It is at its very core what Alan himself has to do in order to save Alice. Now, if you're paying attention up to this point, I haven't really mentioned the story outside of the initial setup and what I just spoke about now. And even then, I want to leave it very ambiguous. This is a game where you need to experience it yourself. It is 100% what you make of it. You can either read into it as much as you want or as little.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, it brings us to the end of another video. I hope you enjoyed this slightly more in-depth look at Alan Wake. We're not going to do a ton of these style videos, as most retro games don't really have a ton to them. However, like the Dead Space video, I'm pretty proud of this one, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you want a more in-depth discussion than what I already did here, please go check out that podcast that I did with Benny over on Cross Circle Squared. If you enjoyed that, you can then watch the Alan Wake 2 one with Jared from Avalanche Reviews. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. If you want to go that extra step, you can hit the subscribe button. If you want to go that extra mile, you can support me on Ko-fi from just $1 a month like these lovely people here. And with that out of the way, I hope you guys stay safe out there. Bye.